Welcome to the Grim Drive podcast, where we explore mental health through the lens of professional sports and athletes. My name is Jotham Busfield. I'm here with my co-host, John Cuna. Today, we will be discussing Demar DeRozan and depression. The first athlete and topic we explored was Kevin Love and anxiety, which can be heard on our podcast feed as well. I remind people just to click subscribe when they're on the podcast feed, just to make sure that they're aware of future episodes. So Kevin Love actually credits DeMar DeRozan with being the first NBA player to speak up about mental health, which motivated him to go and open up about his struggles. So we thought it'd be fitting to really cover DeMar DeRozan in our second episode here. John, how familiar are you with DeMar DeRozan before this?
Not very familiar. I aside from, him as just a talented basketball player, he seems pretty like more of a stoic player on the court. Didn't really see too much from him in that sense. Was really just a really talented player. But other than that, really didn't have too much of understanding about him. I knew he was a big name player coming through college, and I think that was one of the pieces. He was a really talented dribbler. That's one of the big aspects of his game. I know a couple of those pieces, but most of my understanding is him of just as an athlete, which was why it was so interesting to kind of go through some of this stuff and hear more about who he was as a person.
Yeah, absolutely. I think stoic is a great way to put it. His demeanor is all business. His emotional bandwidth on the court is pretty narrow. I think he stays very centered, which is pretty cool. It also is an example of how what's going on inside versus what you see on the outside doesn't always match up.
Right.
That could be, someone looking like they got it all together, but they're struggling. Someone that looks really happy on the outside, but they're really, depressed or down, that kind of thing. So, yeah, for DeMar DeRozan, I think I didn't really know much about him in college. I knew once he got into the NBA, I think he exceeded expectations.
Big time.
Coming out of USC for the Raptors. I know he was, big pals with Kyle Lowry. They were playing together. I think what defined him, at least when I was more aware of him, is when he got traded for Kawhi. Kawhi Leonard came from the Spurs, and DeMar DeRozan went from Toronto to San Antonio. And I think that was kind of a notable trade. Doesn't happen very often. So that's kind of when I started to be a little bit more aware of him. And then obviously he started to speak up about mental health, and we always have an ear towards that. So a quick bio: DeMar DeRozan is an American professional basketball player in the NBA. Plays for the San Antonio Spurs. He played college basketball at USC in California and was selected 9th overall by the Toronto Raptors in the 2009 NBA draft. DeMar DeRozan is a 4-time NBA All-Star and 2-time All-NBA team member. He spent 9 seasons with the Raptors before being traded to the Spurs in the summer of 2018, as we just discussed. DeRozan has played for the U.S. national team in the 2014 World Cup and the 2016 Summer Olympics. A few facts about DeMar DeRozan: he began obsessively dribbling a basketball at the age of 3, and first dunked on a regulation basket when he was in the 6th grade. No big deal.
No big deal.
For anyone listening trying to live up to that, good luck. That's a lot of Grim Drive right there. Won the slam dunk contest at the 2008 McDonald's All-American Game. He grew up in Compton, California, which is widely known as the most dangerous city in California. We'll touch on that a little bit as we go. His mother was diagnosed with lupus when he was a child, so he's done a lot of work to raise awareness about that disease, including his role as a celebrity ambassador for Lupus Canada. Put a link to that in the show notes in case anyone's interested in learning more about that or donating. After DeRozan and fellow NBA player Kevin Love spoke publicly on mental health, it prompted the NBA to add a new rule that requires a team to have at least one full-time licensed mental health professional on their staff, which I think if he didn't, I'm sure he'd say this too, I don't know that, but if he did nothing else with his career, that is a huge legacy piece.
Huge win.
Because of how many people that's going to help, not just in the NBA, but sport. I think NBA is kind of a leader when it comes to mental health compared to other sports. They're way ahead compared to some others, the top 4 or 5 sports.
Yeah, the permission he gave to other people to come out and say something is, like you said, if nothing else, that's a massive win.
For sure. So that's a huge legacy piece for him is just raising awareness by making sure teams have that support. And I'm sure Kevin Love would agree with that as well. So the player spotlight is our first segment today. We're going to talk a little bit about DeMar DeRozan in terms of what we've read. When he's talked about his experience with depression, what he's said, his path is a little bit different than Kevin Love. I think it started with a tweet, which is not, for Kevin Love, it was, came out, did a Players Tribune article, was really vocal in that sense, more detail. But Kevin Love credits DeMar DeRozan with how he started the kind of movement, and he did it with a tweet. In 2018, he tweeted a song lyric, so, quote, "This depression get the best of me," end quote, which he got from a popular song called Tomorrow by Kevin Gates. So he hasn't written any Players Tribune articles. He did have that tweet, which really kind of exploded, and I think people were very vocal about it. I think it raised a lot of awareness. Shows you it doesn't take much.
Yeah.
Right? Sometimes less is more. Right?
Right.
It doesn't take much to really call some attention to something really important. He was interviewed along with Kevin Love for the Aspen Institute as part of a Aspen Ideas Festival by Michael Gervais, a performance psychologist. He was also interviewed along with Michael Phelps by Taylor Rooks, who's a sports journalist, and several other articles have been written about his experience. So, John, what were some of your key takeaways from just hearing DeMar DeRozan talk about his experience with mental health and depression specifically?
You know, one of the biggest ones that stood out in some of the interviews he talked about was the concept of shame. And I think this was sort of riddled throughout all of the interviews he's done, both with Gervais and then just with different, the Globe and pieces like that, his mom, he credits his mom with sort of giving him everyone's got something that they're going through. And so I think that probably planted the seed for him around trying to just not carry shame for struggling with something. And I think that was one thing that he really talked a lot about, was trying to remove that shame, that self-shame for himself, of just being able to admit that something was not okay and that was okay. And I think that kind of helped spark all of this, really, for him to sort of move past beating himself up for feeling something, right? And I think we see that quite frequently. We see people who bury this stuff and hide these things for fear of shame and judgment, and him moving past that, I think, has been, it's it's been a wildfire in the NBA because of it, which has been a huge benefit. So we talked a lot about removing shame and just like, this is who I am. I feel what I feel, and that's okay. And I think that him coming to that place of acceptance, we talk a lot about that in our previous podcast about Kevin Love, but coming to that place of just accepting that this is something that's going on for him, as being like a really, really great place for him to start to then be able to go and do the work. If we can't come to a place of acceptance, we're just constantly in a state of denial. And I thought that was a really great place for him to really key in on, because he's clearly very influential in this realm. And I think for him, Kevin Love talks about the concept of a playbook, and I encourage you to listen to our first one to sort of learn a little bit more about that. But he's sort of reconstructing a new playbook, and I think that was one of the main takeaways that I came up with, and sort of that concept of acceptance and removal of shame. That was one of my bigger ones that really stood out to me. And then he talks a lot about just being okay with speaking up, like just vocalizing and talking and making this more of a conversation that's in light, not in shadows or in darkness, behind closed doors. And we often suffer a lot alone, and him sort of allowing for this dialogue to happen, inviting more people into it, I think has been one of the biggest reasons why we've seen such a shift in the NBA, but then just in general. And I credit him to much of that shift, just because he's speaking up about it and drawing attention to it. And I thought that was courageous and goes against everything that we are conditioned to think as men growing up in this society, right? Tough it out, never talk about this stuff. You're a man if you're weak, emotions are weakness and all that stuff. And for him to come out and carve out a different path, I think was really really important, and that really stood out to me. And then he talks a lot about the life of an athlete. And I thought that this really resonated not only with me as an athlete that was growing up as an athlete, but just in general for a lot of the athletes that I work with. A lot of what he talked about as the life of an athlete really resonated with me, in terms of I found a lot of things that were very common with a lot of the other people that I see, right? This super connection to identity and output, and you're taught how to eat right, you're taught how to exercise right, but you're not really taught how to keep your mind right. And him again drawing more attention to that was one of the biggest things again that I kind of took away from that. And he's helping to develop a more comprehensive, effective training regimen for not just athletes but people in general, that we have to include how to keep our minds right and how to train and how to work on addressing these issues if we want to be more effective and happier. And he talks about being better and being our best selves. And him talking about that we need to address the mind was one of the things that really jumped off the page when I was reading some of these articles or listening to him talk. He really focuses on some of those things, and that was that was really great to hear, honestly, from someone in his using his platform to have that conversation.
For sure, yeah. So you touched on three things right there. Shame was the first one. The second one was, shining light on this as a topic, being the first to kind of come out about mental health struggles. And the third one was life as an athlete and how that, is missing, athletics and growing up as an athlete and being in that realm, still missing the mental support piece, the mindset support piece too, right?
Right.
Like those are two different things, mindset and then mental health.
Yep.
Both important, both a little bit different. I know you've done a lot of work with both those things. So it's definitely, clearly he is someone that's, by speaking out about this, we talked about his legacy and how, if nothing else, the fact that each team is going to have that mental support person from now on. I think it's going to start with that one person. I'm sure it's going to grow to have a whole team. I know some teams have entire staffs for mental health and mental support now. So that's definitely a key piece. That second one you mentioned in terms of shining a light on mental health, on depression, being the first. And you talked about the playbook. What's interesting is that, his background, I think, he alluded a little bit to it. There could be possible trauma in his childhood. I mean, I don't want to speculate because I don't think he's talked about it directly.
No.
But growing up in Compton, the most dangerous city in California, I'd be surprised if there wasn't some witnessing of some pretty dramatic things or some vicarious kind of stuff going through in terms of hearing about people passing away or that kind of thing, or violence, gun violence, stuff like that. So compare that to, Kevin Love was we talked about him when it comes to anxiety and depression. He's more born with maybe a wiring for anxiety issues or issues with depression. This is more of an example of environment. I think you grow up in this type of environment, and the odds of it not impacting you in terms of mental health are pretty slim. So I think that's interesting because the men's playbook that Kevin Love talked about, be strong, don't talk about your feelings, get through it on your own. I think in some environments growing up as a guy, there's always going to be perceived danger with showing weakness and not following that playbook.
Yep.
At a young age, I think the perception is all that really matters. So it might be life or death to you. But in Compton, it might literally be life or death, right? There are some environments where, as a guy, if you are not following that playbook, it's not just perceived risk. There's real risk.
Yep.
I don't think he talked about that. He hasn't really talked a lot about his personal experience from growing up there, so I don't want to speculate. But I would imagine that plays some kind of a role. So, it's also interesting because he didn't find a good fit in therapy. And so I think, for me, not everyone has to work with a therapist. And so I think he talks a lot about opening up, but for him, it was about opening up through a different kind of medium. I think we're using sports to get into difficult mental health topics. He used a song quote to get into something about depression. And he talks about, instead of therapy, he really just relies on surrounding himself with love, which I think is important. So for not everyone's the same, and not everyone has to work with a therapist. I'd be interested to learn more about why he didn't connect with if it's, was it a connection issue? Was it he just really thinks therapy isn't for him? I think a lot of times people struggle to find a therapist that can get on their level and really connect with them. I would imagine his experience growing up in Compton probably made that even more difficult, right? Being an African-American male, trying to find a therapist who, maybe looks or sounds like him and or understands that experience for real. And I think we've done a lot of work with, when it comes to substance abuse. I know a lot of people who struggle with substance abuse do not want to work with a therapist who doesn't have personal experience with substance abuse because they just don't believe that they can really understand it. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. I don't always agree with that, but I think it's true to them, right?
Yeah.
So I think connecting with a therapist is not always easy. I'd be interested. That caught my eye a little bit because I would like to learn more. It's hard to know because he doesn't talk about it a whole lot. And then the first one you mentioned was shame. So shame's interesting because I think what we talk a lot about with clients is the concept of shame versus guilt. Guilt is feeling bad about something you did, right? Again, we talked a lot in the first episode about separating the act from the person and why that's really important. Guilt is about you feel guilty about something you did, an act that you did. Shame is feeling bad about you, right? You're feeling bad about yourself as a person. And for people dealing with shame, I think a good resource is to look into a woman named Brene Brown. She's done a lot of stuff on shame. She's got some YouTube videos on it. She's written a bunch of books, very well known at this point. She's got a good podcast that I think just came out recently. And so she talks about shame shields a lot. She talks about how people cope with shame in unhealthy ways, running away from it, running towards it too much, taking it out on other people, that kind of thing, instead of learning how to sit with it, right? And I think in that Kevin Love episode, we talked a lot about how people try to approach mental health by how do I get it to go away? And they really have to do the opposite. It's counterintuitive, but they got to learn to understand that shame a little bit, and that will help them work through it. So these are some great points that you made. So a couple other takeaways that I had, from listening to him talk about some of these things is that, it clearly took grim drive to get out of Compton. Coming from a place like that, right, you got to have grim drive. I think for him, it may have gone a little bit beyond grim drive. And this is where there's a fine line, right, between, perfectionism can be both a great thing and then backfire down the line. If you're really diving into something more than just a commitment to be excellent at something, but also your only major coping strategy. Because I think it was both for him.
Yep.
And it doesn't diminish the fact that he had to put in as much hard work as he did to be as successful as he has with basketball. I mean, that easier said than done, right?
Right.
And he was able to pull it off.
Or that it
amazing.
wasn't necessary to get out of the circumstances he was in.
Correct.
Right.
But then it's like once you're out of that, you recognize that what got you out of one situation may actually set you up for some difficulty in the next situation. And sometimes it's hard to see that until it's too late, and then you just have to adjust. But
you're so conditioned, that's all you know.
Yes.
Right? So,
yes.
And it worked. So why would you want to shift it if you know that it works for you? Right.
Correct.
You get stuck in that state.
Absolutely. I think for some things like that, you don't want to go back. You wouldn't change a thing maybe because it helped you get where you needed to get from A to B.
Right.
But now that you're at B, how do I adjust? How do I take a step back and revamp my approach so that I'm more balanced? Because what got me from A to B might prevent me from getting from B to C if I'm not careful about it. So I thought that was interesting. Another takeaway is that everyone's different. For most people, playing a sport in the spotlight would cause anxiety. For him, it's the opposite, right? I mean, that is the place where he feels most centered and calm. I mean, you were much farther along with sports. You were a track athlete on kind of an Olympic track, right? And I never got to that level. I played sports in high school. I can't imagine playing, in front of these many people and actually being calm and centered. That is, amazing to me. So I think everybody's different in that sense in terms of what makes them feel anxious. And I think some of the factors with that are where people feel most comfortable determines their level. Where people feel most in control determines their level of comfort. For him, that was where he feels a sense of mastery. He feels a sense of safety from the outside world and what's going on out there. So that's going to bring him comfort because he feels in control. For other people who, circumstances are different, I would not feel in control on a basketball court in front of 20,000 people.
Right.
It would be the opposite. Whereas outside world, everyday life, I'd feel much more in control, so I'd be more comfortable. And then that also points to how certain activities can be distractions from racing thoughts. I think people often a lot of athletes, rely on the sport to distract them from other stuff going on in their life. And that's both better than some other, unhealthy coping strategies, but it doesn't do anything. That stuff's still going to be there when you leave the court or the ice or the field. You got to address it, right?
And then one thing I think happens a lot of times is that then resentment towards the sport actually starts to happen, right? So the athlete then becomes, subconsciously resentful of the thing that they're that they're going to turn to, they're using their sports to distract them from the real issues, and then eventually it turns to this place of I don't find joy here anymore, or I hate this sport, or things like that. It's because they've leaned so heavily on it as a distracting tool, which short-term distraction can be highly effective. Long-term, it leads to these types of issues, and so helping them to understand that is really important, and trying to kind of get back to the joy a little bit. And I'll speak about that in further in a little bit, but that's definitely something that I see, especially when you get to that higher level of athletics, right? Of you've been doing it for so long, you've leaned on it so heavily, and it's covering up things that you need to be addressing, and then resentment starts to build for that sport.
For sure. So two other takeaways I had real quick, and we'll get to these before we switch to the mental health spotlight on depression. One is that external praise, when external praise does not match the internal critic, it can lead to issues, right? So if internally you're struggling and your sense of self is maybe shame-based, and everyone else on the outside is telling you the polar opposite, you're great, you're amazing, you're this star-studded basketball player, and everything's perfect, that difference, right, the gap between those two things can really lead to some people struggling, because it's almost like a constant feeling of invalidation, right? Where in terms of their feelings, right? When people are telling you you're great and you're amazing, everything's fine, and inside you feel like everything's tearing apart, it just makes you feel not understood, right? And that leads to a person struggling a lot of times. So that was one thing that I think came through in him talking. And then the other one is, he clearly recognizes that, which I think this is great, that opening up is not about fixing things as much as it is about getting some relief and kind of shortening the span of time occupied by anxiety or depression. Vulnerability being taking one step back to take two steps forward. And I think we talked about this a little bit in the first episode about Kevin Love and anxiety. Part of getting better is making sure you're not getting worse, right? So it's not necessarily that like opening up is going to fix all your problems, but it might stop things from sliding, continuing to slide in a negative direction. And I thought that was a key takeaway.
Yeah, and I try to, I hear the word fixing all the time, and I talked about this in the first one. People coming in and say, I want to, help me fix this and pieces like that. And I try to steer away from that language because language does matter. And I try to express that there's nothing to fix because you're not broken. And I think that if you come at it from thinking about like something's broken about me, which is a lot of times what people are coming to me with, they feel like there's something that's wrong with them or that they're broken in some way. That's a hard concept to go through. And it's really like to your point, it's really just about learning to embrace and withstand and then move forward. But there's nothing that if you're fixed, it means that something, if you're broken, it means something needs to be, fixed about you. But everybody holds the capacity to move through these situations, and it's about just drawing more awareness to that and building and cultivating ways of doing that. And I think that that's an important thing that I hear that all the time, the fix me. And I always have to say, you're not broken. Yeah. And really trying to rewind it and bring it back to the work that's necessary for them to do.
For sure. And I think in the statement, I'm not, I'm broken, right? Fix me, I'm broken. I think comes the E word, the dreaded E word, expectations that we talked about. There's this what drives people to feel like they're broken is the expectation that they should be farther along, or I should be perfect, or I should be better, or I shouldn't have things wrong with me. No, this is being human. I mean, of course, and especially when you look at what a lot of these people have gone through, if you look at their experience, of course you're feeling the way you're feeling, right? That's actually a normal, healthy response. That's exactly how you should feel. Now, learning how to understand that, respect yourself for going through that, and learning how to cope with it is a whole different story. Right. But if you have expectations that you're supposed to be perfect and not struggling with certain things based on going through really difficult things, that's what gets people into trouble, because their expectations do not align with how things are playing out in reality, and it leads them to feel broken or that something's wrong with them.
Yep.
So we're going to talk a little bit about depression is our mental health issues spotlight for today. We looked at the National Institute of Mental Health, or NIMH, for some data from 2017 on depression. Depression affects 17.3 million adults in the United States, which is 7.1% of all U.S. adults, which actually seems low to me. I think a lot of depression goes unreported, and especially in males, it shows up as what's considered covert depression, not overt depression. Overt depression is the classic kind of depression, which we're going to talk about in terms of the symptoms and signs. Covert depression, especially in guys, can show up in avoidance and anger and other things that might not always be identified. So I think it's often, drastically unreported, and especially 2020 pandemic, the amount of people,
the numbers are going up,
suffering. The numbers are definitely going up. I also think social media, which we might touch on a little bit, has led to those numbers going up since 2014-15, because it's become very ubiquitous with people using social media. Out of that, 7.1% of all U.S. adults struggle with depression. The ratio, the percentage, is highest among individuals aged 18 to 25, and that's 13.1%. Again, I'd be shocked if it's actually that low. That's still a high number, but that's just the people that report it. I would guess it's much higher. So, worth mentioning, suicide is one of the leading causes of death in the U.S. It's the second leading cause of death among those ages 10 to 34. I'm going to repeat that again. Second leading cause of death in the U.S. among those ages 18 to 34. 48,000 suicides alone in 2018. Over the last 20 years, the rate of suicide has increased 35%, which is really scary. The rate of suicide for males is actually 3.7 times higher than females. So those are some staggering statistics, and I think I'd be shocked if, it's hard to know, but the amount of people who end up taking a drastic step like that, I would say depression's probably there 100% of the time. I don't know that, but it's either depression and or other more serious mental illness. Significant mental illness. So, I think there's a difference between sadness and depression. I think this is often like people don't quite get the difference if you've never dealt with it, if you've never dealt with depression. The example I like to give is like the migraine example. For people who've never had a migraine headache, they hear migraine, they're like, oh, yeah, I had a headache. All right, big deal, right? And take some Advil and, keep on trucking. It's not how migraines work, right? They're like debilitating. The whole day is gone. You got to, close yourself in a dark room, that kind of thing. Talk to anyone who's ever had a migraine. They'll tell you. I think the difference between sadness and depression is very similar. yes, depression involves a sad mood oftentimes, but it is really not even close. I mean, anyone can
No.
be sad as a reaction to something that didn't go their way in life, or they heard some bad news, or they read an article that was kind of a downer, or that kind of thing. Depression is really debilitating. It's a whole different category. So we'll talk about depression as a diagnosis. Again, we're jargon free here. If anyone hears us using jargon, please feel free to call us out anywhere, right? Website, Twitter, whatever
Anywhere.
you want to do. Troll away. So depression is defined by 5 or more of the following symptoms. First one is depressed mood most of the day, nearly every day. So think like sad, empty, hopeless. Second one is reduced interest in activities. Third is significant weight changes, so weight gain or weight loss that's not related to dieting. Fourth one is sleep issues, trouble falling asleep, waking up in the middle of the night, and oftentimes what I see the most is trouble getting out of bed in the morning. Slower movement and thinking. That's the fifth one. Sixth one is fatigue or loss of energy nearly every day. Sixth one is feelings of worthlessness or excessive guilt. And the last one is recurrent thoughts of death. So passive or active suicidality. Passive meaning, thoughts of wanting to die, but really not having a plan. Active suicidal thinking is really having a plan in place. So these are, if someone's dealing with 5 or more of those 8 symptoms that we just discussed, there's a good chance that they may be dealing with depression. I believe it's for a 2-week period. If you're having it for a day, that's not the same. You've got to be at least 2 weeks, I believe.
Right.
So, John, what do they do about it, right? We talked about, a key disclaimer with mental health tips. We said this in the first episode. We got to repeat it. A lot of tools and strategies with mental health are easy to understand and hard to execute, right? So the number one reason why they're hard to execute is this mindset of it can't be that easy. It is and it isn't. Some of these strategies with mental health are easy to understand, very, very hard to execute. So I would caution people to just be aware of the mind's tendency to downplay great solutions due to negativity, denial, excuse making, designed to avoid hard work, especially with depression. Depression is like a black cloud, right?
Yeah.
It's going to really be something that changes what your natural thinking might be. It's going to influence that. It's going to be a filter through which that stuff goes through, and it's going to make it all look dark afterwards. So it's easier said than done, but we got to understand the impact. So as always, another disclaimer, always best to seek, professional help and work with somebody. If you think you're depressed, try to get connected. Open up to someone you trust, family member, friend, but also try to get connected to a professional to see what your options are for getting better. So that being said, when it comes to reducing symptoms of depression or people struggling with this, really important issue that's widespread, what would you suggest, John?
I think oftentimes, and again, it's important to remind that all treatment is individualistic for different people, and so what we talk about here is more from like a macro level versus a micro in terms of like you may need different things, and not to say that if you follow these steps that if you are feeling or experiencing these things that things will go away. If you are experiencing some of the stuff that we talked about, we always encourage you to seek help and to talk to somebody about that who can work with you on an individual level. Oftentimes with definitely with more significant depression, medication is a part of that treatment to kind of help the mind and the brain sort of into a place that's stable enough where these techniques are actually most effective. That's another conversation. Obviously, not a prescriber or a doctor, and so that would be a part of the conversation in terms of a treatment plan, to supplement depending on the levels of depression the person may be going through. It's always an important conversation to have with that person around whether that would be helpful or not.
Would you suggest that people typically connect with their primary care doctor, or maybe set up an appointment with a psychiatrist, or either or?
Usually the first step is with their primary care giver, their PCP or their doctor, only because they most likely probably have a little bit more of an established relationship with that person, and they'll be able to sort of give them guidance of, yes, maybe that doctor can do the prescribing there, or maybe they would recommend them seek a psychiatrist and go from there and get a direct referral from there. It's usually an important part of what's happening. And so, but once that sort of, if that's something that's going to be a part of the treatment plan and that gets sort of settled, some of the stuff that I like to sort of talk about is understanding and helping them understand a time when they felt happy. And talk about what were the circumstances that sort of led to that. One, it helps with them understanding that they are capable of feeling something different than what they might be experiencing in that moment. It also shines light for me in terms of what were some of the circumstances that were contributing to some of those things. And I talk a lot about, I call it prescribing joy. and I try to help sort of implement and bring some of that back in. With depression, it is much more challenging because people, especially with experiencing severe depression, even doing things they like to do can be an enormous challenge, right? Even getting out of bed to do the thing that they love the most, they might not have the capability of doing some of those things. And so part of the work, at least in the beginning, is when was a time you felt happiest? What was going on in that period? And are there ways in which we can try to implement more of those and inject joy throughout your day to kind of help remind you of, that it is capable to sort of be in that state? Another thing that we really look to do is developing short and long-term goals. Depending on the level of depression, you may need to do more short-term versus more long-term, but I think helping them understand hope and helping them understand a path forward that doesn't necessarily have to be surrounded by this depressive state, or that it's always going to be this way, helping them understand that there are things, outside of this depression that they can experience, and there are ways to manage this. Depression is, highly treatable. We have far more techniques and tactics of ways of treating this. And I think oftentimes for people who feel depressed, is that you feel like this is just the way it's going to be forever. And that's where that hopelessness comes. Like, what is the point if I'm constantly going to feel this black, dark cloud, or this, this demon that follows me around? If that's going to be something that's my whole life, why do I continue? And helping them understand that, well, let's find one, if one, maybe two things that are meaningful to you, and set up that process of how to move towards that is, again, really, really, really important in terms of the work that we look to do. And then maybe try to identify maladaptive behaviors and habits that might be going on for them, right? So oftentimes, you mentioned sleep. Sleep is a huge contributing factor for depression, and oftentimes their sleep patterns and habits are completely askew. They're going to bed at 3 a.m, waking up at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. You're waking up in the middle of the day, probably already feeling like, well, I've wasted this day, I'm not being productive, and that just sort of feeds into that cloud, and sort of helping them readjust. Well, that might not be serving you the best way. Let's try to think of a better sleep routine to help you get more effective, healthy sleeping habits, and then meet the morning with, here's a couple different things that we're going to look to do in the morning to help set you up for a more successful day. And that's sort of the beginning work of what I like to do in dressing with depression specifically. And then again, sort of following the person with where they are, where are the barriers, where are the hindrances holding them back to being able to do those things, and then addressing those specifically to find ways to sort of, again, manage those things, sit with that sadness or that depression, and then help them move through it.
That's great. Yeah. So the first thing you touched on, when it comes to medication, I think the higher level approach is get a team, right? Talk to your primary care to start. You might, like you said, they might have an existing relationship. Might be easier place to just take a first step.
Yep.
Medication might be part of the approach. It might not.
Right.
But at
Exactly.
least you're learning more. You're finding out what your options are.
Yep.
Hopefully you can get connected to a therapist as well, and maybe those two people can communicate. I mean, you have a team that's really in your corner. I think that's very important. Second thing is, you mentioned identify, a time that they were happy. I think that's great because it really points out that, hey, this is possible. There was a time in your life where this was happening. It gives them some hope and optimism that might be able to happen again, and it gives them a path for how to get back there, right? Because there's some level of familiarity. If they've been happy before, it's easy to identify what were the factors that were going on, right? And that gives them an initial path to get back to that. And you mentioned, prescribing joy, which I think is great. And it's important to note, and I know you've done a lot of work with this, that there's a difference between joy and pleasure.
Yes.
Right? I think a lot of people misidentify joy as pleasure, and they think, well, when I'm joyful, when I'm happy, that's when I'm being flooded with chemicals from drinking or
Yep.
other substances or things that are addictive. It's very important to differentiate those two things because they're not
Great
the
point.
same. You mentioned goal setting and hope, and being able to tap into finding optimism. And I think that relates to one take or one fast fact I kind of have about depression is that you understand the scale of change when you're depressed is very small, right? You got to respect that scale and give yourself credit for the changes you make, right? So if you're fully functioning and you're not depressed and you want to assess like, hey, was I able to, take control of this day and seize the moment and do something impressive, then define yourself by that, right? But when you're depressed, I mean, the scale of what you're trying to do is very small. I mean, even the littlest thing can be the most vital thing for you to get better and feel better. Getting out of bed in the morning,
Yeah.
Making sure you're keeping up with your kind of activities of daily living, right? Making sure you're showering, making sure you're keeping up with your chores. We see a lot of people's spaces taking on their depression, right? And the environment matters in that way. I think for people listening, keep an eye on your bedroom, especially. Like the bedroom is kind of a barometer for how people are doing. If you look around and things are disheveled and there's stuff lying around and you haven't cleaned in forever and you're behind on laundry, not only is that reflective of your mental health, but it's likely impacting your mental health. It's a reciprocal kind of thing. It goes back and forth, right? So again, you mentioned goal setting and hope and finding optimism. These are really key things. I'm going to flag you for jargon.
Sorry.
I got to do it. You said identify maladaptive behaviors.
Oh, yeah.
What is a maladaptive behavior?
So a maladaptive behavior might be, waking up in the morning and flooding your system with substances, right, to cope and manage, right? So you wake up, you're going to be in a depressed state, and your habit forming has, you've gone into, well, if I just chug this fifth of whatever, or I wake up and I smoke some weed, right? Then those are going to be things that I learned to do. And we've talked about substances in the past, and with everything that's been going on with the pandemic, we've actually seen a pretty enormous spike in substance use. But that would be sort of a maladaptive behavior in terms of, you've taught yourself and conditioned yourself to do something that is not effectively contributing to your overall mental health. And so substances would be one, or, waking up and not taking care of yourself, or, not showering, or whatever it happens to be, like those types of things that really
isolating
yourself,
yep.
Right? Cutting off ties with people that you once had, relationships with. That type of stuff is you really want to highlight those and reflect them back, and not from like a judgmental standpoint of like stop doing this, but more from a curiosity standpoint of like I'm wondering why, and I'm curious of if we looked to do things differently, right? How might that impact you? And I think your point too about incremental change with depression, it's much more on a you got out of bed today, awesome. That's great. What worked for you? How'd you do that? That's wonderful. And how do we build from there? I think is great. I think again, we've talked a lot about expectations, but if if the expectation is going to be waking up with a smile on your face and everything's golden and great for every day, all day, you're going to be left with feeling disappointed quite frequently. And so I think managing those types of things. But when I talk about maladaptive behaviors, you have to identify them for that person, be able to reflect sort of what they might be contributing to, and then talk about, well, how about we substitute that with some other behaviors that might be different and see what happens. And that's a lot of what I was talking about for that.
So it's, kind of identifying and removing unhealthy behaviors.
Yep.
So maladaptive is unhealthy and getting more adaptive or
Yep.
healthy behaviors in place. I think that's great. So I'm going to go through a couple, fast facts I have about depression that I usually like to kind of give to people. One is depression is not you. You are not your depression. I mean, we have to view that as an external force, not ourself. A lot of times people, again, we've talked about separating the act from the person. We got to also separate, other aspects of mental health from ourselves in terms of our identity. Depression is not you. We have to view that as this external force that we are dealing with, right? And that actually helps because we're kind of trying to compete against something instead of just hate ourselves for that identification. Second one is understand the scale of change with depression is very small, like you said. If your depression is like the 500-pound gorilla, if you got that gorilla on your back, getting out of bed, right? Think quite literally, right? 500-pound gorilla on your back, getting out of bed is hard. It's hard, and it's probably the most important thing you're going to do to start that day. So it does deserve praise. It does deserve being commended for that.
Mm-hmm.
I think people a lot of times roll their eyes. They don't want to give themselves credit, but they have to visualize that gorilla. If that's what you got going on, getting out of bed is hard. I mean, it is like the most important thing. So you got to give yourself credit and understand that the scale of change with depression starts very small. And like you said, you build from there, right? Build on top of it. Third one is be aware of the key difference between feeling run down and tired when sick physically versus feeling those symptoms due to depression. I think we're taught growing up, like when we're sick, if we have a cold, if we are dealing with the flu or that kind of thing, we're taught that our bodies run down and we need rest. Right? We need rest. We can't be active. We got to let our immune system catch up in order to get healthy. With depression, you feel those same things, and I think psychologically, it's like, all right, well, I don't have the energy. I can't do these things. I have to just relax and stay in bed. It's the opposite. It's really like you have to jumpstart your system. It's not like being physically sick. When you're depressed, you actually have to generate your own motivation and energy. And as tired and as lethargic as you are, getting out of bed, trying to exercise a little bit, trying to walk, 15 minutes a day, those things, as hard as they are, it really is like asking someone to climb a mountain when they're depressed. But that is going to uplift you. That is going to uplift your mood. It's going to boost your energy. It's going to boost your mood. It's not going to fix everything on the scale of a day, but it is going to help. And most importantly, they have to understand that psychologically, when you're run down, your body and mind will tell you to stay still. With depression, you have to realize that it's the opposite. So that's the third one. Fourth one is talk to someone, right? We talked about that. Part of getting better is making sure you're not getting worse. So you need to feel validated for the things they're going through. And the fifth one I have in terms of these kind of quick points, focus on yourself to a point, right? Initially, it's good. You want to get into therapy, get healthy, open up, talk about things. But eventually, too much focus on the self can kind of backfire, right? It's like looking in a mirror too much. Mm-hmm. If you're hyper-focused on looking in the mirror from a distance of 6 inches 20 times a day, guess what? You're going to find some things that don't look perfect.
Right.
And I think, working on yourself, dealing with depression can kind of be like that sometimes. It's really good to get support. It's really good to work on yourself and make changes. But at some point, you have to recognize that too much focus on yourself an unbalanced focus is also not a good thing. So try to put a little bit of your focus on helping others too. And Demar DeRozan actually talks about this. He talks about how helping others is really such an empowering thing for him. Helping others, being around love and helping others is really what uplifts his mood the most. And it's interesting because by focusing less on ourselves, we actually end up feeling better, which I think is key. Any thoughts on those?
Okay. No, I think those are all really important to keep in mind.
So you talked about, maladaptive behaviors, and, I think one of the approaches we use when it comes to depression is what's called CBT, or cognitive behavioral therapy. And we're not going to get all jargony with that, but basically it just means looking at behavior change, right? Changing the things you're doing on a daily basis. And then the cognitive piece is looking at thoughts. Like, what are your thought patterns? What do you think on a day-to-day basis about yourself, about your future? That's really all cognitive behavioral therapy is. Looking at behaviors, looking at thoughts. I often find that it's easier to start with behavior change than it is with cognitive changes or thought changes. I think when people are depressed, they're very entrenched in their thought patterns about themselves, about the world, their future. Very hard to get out of those. Behavior change is it's still hard, but a little bit easier, and it does jumpstart, almost like you're starting a lawnmower, right? It gets things going a little bit, which I think if someone's at like a 10 out of 10 on depression scale or 9 out of 10, if you do a little bit of behavioral change first, take some, get rid of those maladaptive behaviors, put some healthy ones in place, you can get them down to like a 6 or 7 sometimes. Trying to make some changes in your thought patterns from a 6 or a 7 is night and day from a 9 or a 10, right? So we like to start with some behavior change. So behaviors can be active or passive. Think active is like exercise, right? Passive is more like avoidance and isolation. So we want to look at, like you said, removing as many of those maladaptive or unhealthy behaviors as we can, and implementing as many healthy behaviors as we can. That's the first step we usually take. So healthy behaviors are, exercise, right? Goal setting. We talked about process over product when it comes to goal setting. Spending time with trusted family and friends. So that's the opposite of isolation. With depression, we tend to isolate and avoid. You got to be around the people that are meaningful to you because they are a piece of the puzzle. Healthy morning and night routines and prioritizing sleep. Doesn't mean your sleep's going to be perfect, but you have to have some approach to making sure you're getting your sleep as good as you can. And then the last one is mindfulness-based meditation and breathing techniques. So these are all behavioral changes that a person can make. On the thought-based side, the cognitive side, I think once you've done some of this, the behavioral changes, first I look for how are we treating ourselves? Are we treating ourselves like the best coach and boss we've ever had, or like our worst possible coach and boss, right? I think a lot of times people are if a boss talked to them the way they talk to themselves on a day-to-day basis, they would quit that job in 2 seconds. If a coach talked to them this way, they would quit that team, right? Or they would just at least be very unhappy. So it's about treat yourself like a best friend. Talk to yourself, kind of like you would talk to a best friend or talk to someone that you're mentoring or coaching. We talked in the last podcast about counteracting the slant towards negativity. This is a kind of a cognitive piece too, or a thought-based piece too. It's our brain is slanted towards being negative. We have to have some strategies in place that help it see a little bit more of the positive, even more so with depression. Depression is going to put that black cloud on everything. Everything's going to look terrible. We have to have a way to try to eke out a little bit of light in some of the things that are happening day to day, because the scale is small, but it's going to help uplift a person. And the other kind of metaphor or analogy I like to use with people is think think of battling depression like a puzzle, not a labyrinth. A puzzle is like you're problem solving, you're trying to be adaptive. If a piece doesn't fit, you move it, you find another one, you're trying to solve it. A labyrinth is like if you got these huge walls, and if you go down the wrong path and you hit a dead end, it's just catastrophe, right? Oh my, I'm never going to get out, and that kind of stuff, right? It's very daunting. So puzzle, not labyrinth. Last thing I would add is social media these days. Temper your use with that, right? If you're on it all the time, it's probably not helping. Doesn't mean you have to get off it forever, but use it sparingly. So what do you think about that stuff?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it's easy too to kind of go from one end of the spectrum to the other with social media, and then there's certainly positivities that you can gain from it, but we're not going to necessarily bog down with the research, but there's plenty of research to show the correlation between depressive symptoms that go up with longer prolonged exposure to those types of platforms, specifically Facebook. And so you really have to tailor that. And when I'm working with clients, I'll have them pull out their phone. Let's look at the screen time. Let's look at where are you spending most of your time. And in terms of maladaptive behaviors, if they're looking at a 6, 7, 8 hour weekly average, and 4 of those hours is on social media, we start talking about, if you were to cut that in half, what would you? Let's think about, let's cut 2 hours off of that and add 2 hours of joy and start to manage those different pieces. I think is part of it can be really, really helpful. And one other thing too that you mentioned, one thing I wanted to add about some of the behavior changes, I think nutrition is one. I certainly am not a nutritionist, nor do I know a lot about it, but I do know it can really be beneficial towards the people. And with a depressed state of mind, we maybe typically lean more towards those, high fat, high sugar type of nutrition, types of pieces to sort of like help us feel that pleasure you were talking about.
Totally.
And I think trying to help them understand like other types of nutritional pieces that might help to contribute, making them feel better about themselves, putting healthy food into their body kind of helps feel like I'm taking care of myself, and can kind of, you talked about that, like even if it's a speck of light, can kind of make that a little bit brighter. So I think it's really a comprehensive approach to sort of tackle it in a bunch of different places to make them feel the best that they can.
For sure, yeah. Nutrition is definitely a big piece, and it's again another one of those things that people might roll their eyes at. And it's
sure,
like, yeah, sure,
yep.
It's easy to identify.
Yep.
Good luck executing it. It's not easy, and it takes a lot of focus and effort and consistent hard work to make that happen. It does make a huge difference on our wellness day to day.
Yep.
And with social media, like you said, I think watching The Social Dilemma, right, that documentary, I think it's pretty widespread at this point, but in case people that are listening haven't heard of it, it's, I believe, on Netflix.
Yeah.
And it's, it's not a huge time commitment. I think it's like 75, 80 minutes. And it goes into, a lot of details related to social media platforms, how they were created, how they kind of hijack the brain's tendency towards being addictive, and a lot of other pieces. So I think it's informative, it's validating. I would encourage anyone to go see that, and we'll put a link to it in the show notes as well. And I also think with social media, again, it's not an all or nothing kind of thing, right? We want to temper our use. We don't have to get off of it, but try to balance it with some joy. And you can even do that on the platform. I think if you look at how the algorithms are set up, they're going to keep feeding you stuff based on what you're looking at and clicking. And so you got to be aware of that, because the brain's slanted towards negativity. So look at who you're following on Twitter. Look at these different types of things, because you can now try to follow some people that have some uplifting thing, right? Watch some puppy videos. I mean, like there's a lot of stuff on there that's going to be at least a little bit of counteracting some of the negativity and the political stuff and all the other stuff that we know just gets all encompassing quickly. So balancing it out that way. So this being the Grim Drive podcast, we do like to give an example of Grim Drive. Do you have one for today?
No, I talked a little bit about sort of my own personal experience, but I think there's plenty of different people out there that do. We talked about my own experience. We talked about the just nurses and doctors right now, given the pandemic, as being a huge piece of someone that, like, you just have to tirelessly be working towards that goal, because it's it's incredibly important to you. And so there's tons of different people in that same realm that work the extra mile. I would say one of the things right now is teachers and educators is I quite frankly don't know how they're doing it. They're being given kind of a real
remote
tough
learning
with remote learning.
Yeah.
Some teachers are being forced back into buildings. They don't really feel comfortable doing that. They're having to do remote learning. They're not really haven't gotten too much education on that. I think that they're trying as hard as they possibly can. My hat's really off to teachers and educators right now trying to teach right now, and their grim drive really is to help kids and educate kids, and that's sort of what is sustaining them through this. But with conversations I've had with educators, it's a real challenge right now, and they're working as hard as they can. And I think that that internal purpose of if you're an educator and if you're a teacher, that's what you were meant to do. And I think that that's what's helping carry them through right now, given the circumstances of just the enormous amount of difficulty that they're up against.
Yeah, and parents too. I mean, parents trying to work from home and supervise and oversee this remote learning stuff and figure out the technology and troubleshoot those things. Hats off to all those people. I mean, it's really just a tough time. I'm going to go with a lighthearted example of Grim Drive for today. There was this thing, I'll put a link in the show notes on it, but it was this post on Twitter that just showed this rescued beaver who is in this, the person who rescued him is trained to do it, and they rehabilitate and get them back to a healthy level before they release them back into the wild, I'm assuming. And it was just showing this. It kind of relates, I think, to DeMar DeRozan growing up and really putting on the Grim Drive to be able to master a skill of basketball and become one of the best in the world at it. Just relentless pursuit of that skill, of that goal. And I think almost to the point where it's so ingrained, it's just he can't shut it off, right? I think this beaver was doing the same thing, right? They are just programmed to build dams. And within this woman's house, I think it was a woman, within this woman's house, he's in a finished basement, and he's just walking around this carpeted basement just grabbing pool cues and benches and little kids' toys, and he's building these dams everywhere. And to me, it was just hilarious because this guy can't shut it off. I mean, he's nowhere near nature, and he's still building dams in whatever way he can, right? Because he's going to put in work on that day. I found it hilarious, and I thought it resembled kind of Grim Drive a little bit in a strange way. So we'll put a link to that in case anyone wants to see that kind of funny post. So as we get to the end here for today, a quick reminder to click subscribe on your podcast listening platform and rate and review the podcast if possible. We really appreciate all feedback we can get on this. We're going to offer a pair of free Celtics tickets to a game in 2021 to 2022. This season's kind of a wash upcoming because they're not going to have fans in person, I don't think. But for the 2021-2022 season, for one lucky person out of all who write an honest review for us in the first 3 months of 2021, you can enter to win these tickets by taking a screenshot of your review and submitting that through the Contact Us option on our website at grimdrive.com. That's GRIMDRIVE.com. It'll ask you for your name and email address, and we'll provide you with the option to upload a screenshot of the file of your review. So make sure you take the screenshot of your review before you submit it. Then click Submit on the browser you're on, and you can upload that screenshot through our Contact Us page on our website, grimdrive.com. One other reminder, all the helpful information and links that we described today can be accessed in the show notes and on our website at grimdrive.com. Thanks for listening to the Grim Drive podcast for this discussion about DeMar DeRozan and depression. See you next week when we discuss Serena Williams, and I'm going to leave it there, and I'm going to tease it a little bit. We're not going to give away exactly what we're discussing with regards to mental health and Serena Williams, but she will be the player we'll discuss, and next week that will be the episode.
Sounds good. Thanks, everyone.